All right. Well, welcome to the Engaged Truth Show. My name is Caleb Harrelson. I'm super excited to have you guys watching us today. And that you see here is a new layout. I apologize for the Star Trek part. I thought I edited that out there, but I'm super excited to have you guys here. Today, we're going to be talking about a very exciting topic. We're going to be looking at the global flood and the evidence for it and the objections that we hear against it that are popular today. And I have joining me today my friend Ian Juby. So excited to have you with us today, Ian. How are you doing today?
Caleb, I'm doing just grand. How about yourself?
Oh, doing well, doing well. Staying very hot in El Paso, Texas. And now, are you in Canada? Is that right?
I'm in Eastern Ontario, and it's hot here today too, probably 75, 80 degrees.
Oh yeah. Well, awesome. Well, it's so good to have you with us, and I'm not jealous at all. So I'm excited to have you with us, as I know you've been in creation ministry for a long time, and if you maybe you can just tell us a little bit about what you do and just your background, real quick.
Sure. I've been teaching science and technology since I was about 16 years old. Actually, I started teaching at a what was at the time the first and only summer science camp here in Eastern Ontario. It was the first and only in the world that we knew of, and it was that way for about 10 years. It was really leading edge in the world. And about 10 years later, there was summer science camps popping up all over the place, all over the world. But that was where I got my start. And I've always been just loved science and technology as a whole. Sorry, I'll try not to shake the camera too much here. I got on a big long arm here, spring loaded. But from there, because I was a Christian and because I got saved, and it's a long story, but basically I'd walked away from the Lord for about 8 years or so, pretty much destroyed my whole life. And but when I returned to the Lord, I wound up down in Texas at Last Days Ministries, which of course was started by Keith and Melody Green, and they had just recently become a Youth with a Mission base. And so I went there, and I was with them for about 4 years or so. Took my discipleship training school with them, and they had a full television recording studio there, and they had speakers and teachers come literally from all over the world to record videos and record teachings and whatnot. One of the guys they had come in was Dr. Carl Baugh from just around the corner in Texas, at over in Glen Rose, and he came and did a 6-hour lecture off the top of his head. And this was all stuff, just riveting stuff. I had never heard this before, and I was just thoroughly blown away. And so I wound up going over and volunteering at the museum in Glen Rose. There, they were having their first ever creation fair, and I think they had, if I remember correctly, they had 5,000 people show up that weekend. It was unreal, and this was the first time they had ever done this, and so they had literally thousands of people go through this creation fair. And it was fun because I was at the museum for a couple of weeks, and I'm an informationaholic. So for me, it was awesome because you just sit there and you have all these scientists and researchers and teachers from literally from all over the world, all disciplines, all walks of life, come to this museum in the middle of Texas, and you just get to sit there and soak up information. So I did that for weeks on end, and just got addicted to the topic, and wound up back here in Canada, and wound up teaching at a high school here in Eastern Ontario for 10 years. And that wasn't planned. I was just looking to go back to Texas to go back into missions work, and wound up with this job totally out of the blue. And that first year, I got asked to speak on the creation evolution topic multiple times in several different classes. And that was how I got my start in the creation evolution discussion and lecturing on it. And so I taught at the high school for 10 years, went into full-time creation ministry. I built a creation museum in that that 10 years that I was at the high school, and then went on the road for 10 years full time with that traveling museum. Traveled all over North America and just loved it.
Yeah, that's
especially
awesome.
yeah, especially doing the kid stuff. I really enjoyed doing the kid stuff. I'm not sure if they had more fun or I had more fun.
Right.
And it was awesome, but it didn't quite pay the bills. And unfortunately, so I wound up in a lot of debt. So I went and worked. Well, two things happened. First, I started producing a television show called Genesis Week. And originally it was just on YouTube. And a pastor friend of mine out in Newfoundland, yes, that's you, Dino, I'm talking about, messaged me privately, and he's like, you should really approach Miracle Channel about this. And originally, when I had put together the pilot episode for Genesis Week, it was a very different show. It was going to be in the field, interviewing people. I did the first pilot show was on the Biloxi Riverbed during the excavations of the dinosaur and human footprints. And anybody can go and join these excavations. And so I put together this pilot show with the intention of being for broadcast television. And Miracle Channel here in Canada was Canada's first Christian television station. It's very different in Canada from the US. It was actually illegal to have a Christian television or radio station.
Really? Wow.
Until Miracle Channel came along. And there was, I believe, CHRI radio station here in Ottawa was the first Christian radio station to also get that, to put themselves out there as a Christian radio station. So at any rate, I went and pitched the show to Miracle Channel. This would have been, 17, 18 years ago. And it didn't go very far, and just as well. At any rate, 10 years later, I wound up producing Genesis Week, which was strictly for YouTube at first, and it was analysis of the current events, news, things like that, and giving a creationist perspective, a creationist analysis, and coming at it from the scientific perspective. I love science, and this is creation evolution. It's my field of expertise, right? So started producing that and produced, I think, 8 or 9 shows on YouTube. And they really took off. But I took those shows as the pilots for Miracle Channel and pitched it again at my pastor friend's suggestion. And they loved it. And they have continued to carry it. So this has been 8 years now. So I produced 5 seasons on television. And so basically what happened was I was producing the show as well. So I had to be home because I was producing that from home. I wasn't on the road anymore. Yeah. And again, none of this quite paid the bills, which is really ironic because, the atheist skeptics often shout, oh, you're in it for the money.
Yeah.
Yes, I slept in the front seat of my van for the first 2.5 years on the road because I was so rich and making so much money at this. Anyway, so I went and went back into the secular workforce and actually worked for Canadian National Railroad here for almost 7 years. Loved the job, loved the paycheck. It was sure nice having a job where you work for someone else. And so the intent was to work that job for several years, pay down my debts, save up some money to carry on the ministry and then go back into ministry. And so I was producing the TV show again, still from home, but in my off hours. And one of the things about working for the railroad is there is no schedule. You get called whenever the train shows up. It could be 3 in the morning. It could be 3 in the afternoon. That's 365 days a year. It's just, it doesn't stop. So it made it really, really tough, but I managed to produce 5 seasons on television, and I just got burnt out and I had to take a break for a couple of years. So I just started remaking the Complete Creation series, what I call a series of videos called Complete Creation. And so I'm doing the third edition now. First edition was on YouTube, and that was the first or second year that YouTube came out. It was before Google bought them, put it to you that way. It was when it was still YouTube. And I produced the first, it was supposed to be an exhaustive series of videos covering the whole of creation evolution topic. And I really did a lot of things wrong. And that's fine. It was a learning experience, right? But I collaborated with a church just outside of Chicago, Lake Zurich in Illinois. And I went there for a week, and so basically I did a whole series for the whole week there, first for the church and then for also the Bible college, which they have there. So I was teaching the Bible college students, and they had capability of full television recording. So we recorded the series there. Yeah. That became the Complete Creation series second edition. So now I'm updating it with the third edition, and I've got 13 parts out now, probably be somewhere between 30 and 40 parts by the time I finish. So I'm just ramping up now to start in another week or two to start recording the other episodes, because we're now coming into September. I took a break for the summer. I had to move and all kinds of stuff.
Sure. How many episodes is it going to be in total?
I don't know. So, at least 30.
Thorough. Oh, really?
Yeah, it's at least 30 half-hour episodes. So so it's upwards around 15 hours. It might be as high as 40. I kind of laid down the topics, but that list keeps getting longer and longer the more I go on. So I don't know how long it's going to go for now.
Yeah. Well, I started watching a few of them already, and I'm excited. It's like finding a new show that you love, and so I'm really enjoying those. Now your channel, correct me if I say it wrong. It's Wazulu, or how do you say it?
Sure, Wazulu. It's a made-up word anyway, so you can have whatever way you like.
Is there a story behind that, or how you chose that name?
Sure, it's a weird one, but this is dating myself again. This is back in the days of ICQ. Do you remember that?
ICQ.
The very first instant messenger program.
Oh wow, I remember MSN Messenger. My wife and I, when we were young.
Yeah, this was before MSN Messenger. So this again when I was teaching at the high school. In fact, I remember with the owners of the science camp, Carol, Wayne, and I were down in Ottawa, and I was just talking with Carol. We were trying to figure out when this was, because we were at a conference in Ottawa and we attended a talk. What is the internet? And give you an idea of how long it's been at this. Wow. So ICQ, a whole mess of the students at the high school were on ICQ, and so I tried to sign up for it, and every username I typed in was taken. So I made up a name, Zulu Heembob, and it just kind of stuck. So it wasn't taken, so I used it.
Zulu. That's awesome. Well, it's a great channel. You have like over 7,000 subscribers and a lot of great content. So it's kind of like finding a gold mine on the internet. So, well, let's get into our topic today. Before we get into that, someone asked a question. Let's see if I can pull it up here. Are the updated videos just on YouTube or on DVD?
They are on YouTube at the moment. They are not quite on. They're going to be on Blu-ray, DVD, and video on demand. Miracle Channel just started their video on demand service. They're sort of their version of Netflix. It's called Corco, and you can access it through Miracle Channel. They're all on there in high definition, live streaming. But the Blu-ray DVDs are not out yet. I still have to master them, and I've been working so hard at just getting the different parts produced and on schedule, because now you're on a weekly schedule for TV again. Because these are airing as I'm producing them. They're airing on TV, and it's nationally or internationally as well. It's not just on Miracle Channel here in Canada, which is national. Doug Sharp, who runs the TV show Revolution Against Evolution down in the States, the station he broadcasts on is also broadcasting it. There's a station in South Africa which is also broadcasting it. So at any rate, yeah. So that's
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Well, that's good to know. Good to know all the formats where it'll be available, and I'm sure it'll be updated on Facebook as well.
Yes.
So you got a hello from Donnie Maxwell here.
Hey, greetings, Donnie.
Yeah. So this is cool. I'm loving this StreamYard. So let's get into our topic today: uniformitarianism versus flood geology. So as before we even get into defining those terms, we should talk about really the linchpin of worldviews. I would say it comes down a lot to how you view history, particularly how do you view geologic history. If there was a global flood, then it explains a lot of things we see as far as the layers today. And if there wasn't a global flood, then you have the storyline, the narrative of the deep time, and you have the narrative of Darwinian evolution assumes that worldview, assumes that perspective on the geologic time period. So maybe we can get into talking about what is uniformitarianism and Charles Lyell and who are all these key figures here in this discussion, and why it matters so much as it relates to biblical timeline, particularly in Genesis.
Yeah, because that's a really big word.
Yeah, exactly. Hard to say that 10 times real fast.
Yeah, that's right. And again, I'm glad you got it on the screen here. And forgive me, by the way, if I look like I'm looking way over to the side, it's because I got dual monitors going on. And they're huge. You're way off to the sides here. So, but just look at the root word uniform. And it's this idea that geological processes have been uniform throughout time. They've been slow, continual geological processes that we even see today. And most people don't get the connection right off the bat. And it's funny because you even mentioned one of the pieces of evidence for Noah's flood, and that's rock layers, as like Ken Ham and Buddy Davis say, billions of dead things buried in rock layers all over the world. Everybody sees it. The evidence is all around you. And so, these hardcore atheists in particular, but rather foolish skeptics have made silly statements like there is absolutely no evidence for a global flood whatsoever. That's arrogant and ignorant statement. First of all, you're basically claiming that you have knowledge of all scientific evidence, of all geological evidence in the entire universe, and you know that there is no evidence for a global flood. It's a ridiculous statement. You can't make that statement. You would have to be God. It's ridiculous. Yeah. And the real irony here is that if you take a look at this picture here,
here, let me switch. There we go.
This has been hijacked by the advocates of deep time and the uniformitarian geologists, and because what you're looking at here is evidence for a global flood. Yet, what we see, and this is a common meme you'll see in the internet, people show this very picture and with the caption, millions of years in one picture. So if you can see what's happened here, they've taken away the global flood of Noah and replaced it with millions of years. That is exactly what's happened, and that is why the topic of uniformitarian geology is so important. And people don't know this because they don't know the history. This idea of millions of years, this wasn't arrived at by scientific study and research. It was basically brought forward by one guy, you mentioned it by name, Sir Charles Lyell, who had, for whatever reasons, had severe anaphylactic allergy to anything dealing with catastrophe. And he actually sought to replace the worldwide flood of Noah in the biblical account with another story of deep time. You see, Charles Lyell was trained as a lawyer. That's what he went to school for. And this was actually his tactic was, I would contend, has been the most effective weapon ever launched against the Bible in the history of mankind. And I would contend that because when you, if someone walks up to you and says, "Oh, this book is," if they burn the book, for instance, did that make the Bible go away? No. Did they ban the book? There's been multiple groups that have attempted to ban the Bible. Did that make it go away? No, it made it more popular. Yet, nowadays, when you talk about this book as a literal history book, the first thing that comes out of people's mouth is, "Oh, the earth is millions, billions of years old. We know that book can't possibly be true because that book says it's only a few thousand years old." This was all a tactic by a lawyer who is now known as the father of the modern science of geology, Sir Charles Lyell. Now, we wouldn't have known what he was doing except that in his private writings and correspondence, he actually, if I can find the slide here, I'm gonna switch this. I'm gonna switch this to another slide here, if I can, because we wouldn't have known what his intentions were, except that he wrote about what he was doing in private writings and correspondence and, to friends and family and whatnot. And after he died, his sister published these letters. And actually, I've got it memorized, so I guess there's no point in trying to look it up. But he wrote in one letter, he wrote to one gentleman. He said he came up with the idea about 5 or 6 years ago that if ever I was to discredit the the geology according to Moses, I would do it in an historical sketch. So let me translate the Old English for you. Basically, what he was telling this friend of his was he had come up with this idea about 5 or 6 years ago. If he was going to discredit the geology according to Moses, the Bible, Genesis, the book of Genesis, and a global flood, if he was to discredit this book without offending its believers, he would do it by making up his own history. Now, this is profound for multiple reasons. Number one, he's a lawyer. This is a legal tactic. When you are in a court of law, you try and come up with a story that's believable, that convinces the jury that your story is the one to be believed, that explains all the evidence that's been presented in court, but never once mentions the arguments of the prosecutor. And so by doing this, because of the moment you even mention the arguments of the prosecution, you have now given their arguments credence in the minds of the jurors. So it's a very subtle legal tactic. It has nothing to do with science. Completely unscientific. But that is exactly the principle that he applied in coming up with this new history. And this new history was called uniformitarianism. This uniformitarian geology, the idea that geological processes today are the same as they always have been throughout all of time. He's the one that coined that phrase. Maybe you've heard of this. The present is the key to the past.
Yeah.
Heard that?
Yep.
So most people have. If you actually take a look at that phrase, it's interesting because you'll notice he didn't mention Noah's flood. He didn't mention the evidence for Noah's flood. But what he did do in one sentence is he presented his story that present-day processes could be applied to the past, and he ruled out all other stories without even mentioning them. He completely disqualified a global flood because he said that only present-day processes can be accepted to interpret the past geological evidence. Now, have you seen a global flood recently?
No.
Me neither. In fact, God himself promised he would never do it again.
Right.
So what Lyell did was and this is why I'm saying it has been the most effective weapon against the Bible that has ever been concocted on planet Earth. He has disqualified this book, the biblical account of creation, Genesis, and specifically the flood of Noah. He discredited it all without even mentioning it by promoting his new history, the idea of millions of years of slow and methodical, repeatable geological processes, and counting on there never being another global flood. So anyway, it has nothing to do with science. Yet, this is the theory that has taken hold today.
Sure.
And Lyell, I don't think Lyell ever put actual dates on anything before he died. He just kind of left it out there of this idea that it's just time, millions, who knows, billions of years. I don't know. He didn't put a date on it. So now when you take a look at all these rock layers around the world, as we just saw, it's even a meme running on the internet now. Millions of years in one picture. So when in actual fact, what we are looking at here, this beautiful mountain out in Banff, and I've got this picture as my background picture because right in there is actually a series of rock layers. It's called what conventional geologists call an overthrust. You've got older rock layers sitting on top of younger rock layers by their terms.
Wow.
And I actually took that picture climbing up to go investigate that layer quite a few years ago. But anyway, it's backwards. If these layers were laid down over time, why are older rock layers on top of younger rock layers? It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
They claim these older rock layers broke up and slid over top of the other ones. Sure, you know what? I'll even give them that. I'll say that's a possibility, even though the physics don't line up. Because you can do the math. The weight of the rock on top, and you take that and you slide those rocks apart across each other, they will melt the rock. It's pretty simple physics. And so the reason I went up there was to look at that contact, and it's hard to find because it's such a perfect, clean contact. There's nothing suspicious about it. There's no indication of heat. There's no indication of sliding. There's nothing. It's just these conventional dating methods made this layer of rock older than this one. And so they claimed it slid over the other, even though there's no evidence of that. Anyway, got me off on a sidetrack.
Hey, no, that's interesting. I haven't heard of that upside down rock. Like, so that would say in flood geology, I'd say when the sediments were soft, it kind of bent it, or how would you explain that?
Well, if all of this was moved around, like let's give them, and because there's been all kinds of like drill cores through all these rock layers, right? I mean, especially in Alberta, because that's the oil capital of Canada. They've drilled through all those rocks. So let's give them that for a second and say, it's a repeating sequence of rocks sitting on top of the other, which I agree. I've seen the drill cores. But let's assume for a second it's not just a repeating cycle of flooding, because the global flood of Noah happened over many months. It wasn't an overnight event. So let's say there was a repeating sequence, instead of a repeating sequence, let's say that truly these rock layers did slide over the others. Really, the only way you can do that is if there's water acting as a lubricant in between the layers. So you wind up with the demands of a global flood, even using their interpretation, which I'm not convinced either way, frankly. I've gone up there. I understand the cores make a good argument. I'm not convinced. There is no evidence of heating. There's no evidence of sliding. There's no evidence of friction. So what do you do with that? There's no evidence of moving. And the other thing too, and Dr. Walter Brown, whose PhD is in physics, also showed in his book the math involved in pushing rock layers. And the moment you get to rock layers this thick, because that was, I think this was 2,000 vertical feet.
Wow.
Thick of rock layers that allegedly slid over the others. And this is miles and miles or kilometers, sorry, of I forget the total width of those layers that allegedly moved. If you push on one end, it will crush the rocks from the force of the pushing before it moves that slab of rock layers. So the physics just don't add up. Was it sliding downhill? Well, okay, that's another possibility. But then, you now start getting into ad hoc explanations. Okay, these mountains have risen up. Were they originally going downhill thousands of feet first, and now they're going uphill thousands of feet? So you kind of wind up going into question after question after question. Whereas if you just look at it as a repeating sequence of rocks during a global flood, well, there are no problems with physics. It just happens. So,
yeah. Well, while we're on the mountains themselves, on that topic, I hear a lot of people say, well, there's not enough water to even cover the entire Earth. I always hear that. I have one friend say to pretend that the volume of the planet's water doubled in the course of a month and then magically disappeared back to the current levels is bad. But there's a couple of problems, I think, with the statement. You said the flood lasted over several months. I mean, over a year, right?
Yes, and I've forgotten his name right now. There was a paper that came out a few years back at the International Conference on Creationism, and it was two researchers, and all they did was look at the Hebrew grammar of the biblical account of the flood. And basically, they came to the conclusion, because of the grammar, because of the way it says, actually, I'll see if I can, I'm kind of hoping I have the slideshow, because I've actually got the quote. Nope, that's Lyell.
Yeah.
I'll see if I can find the quote, the citation from the book of Genesis, because it's an important. It's best to actually see it. No, that was Peter. Close, but not what I'm after. At any rate, what they concluded was that Noah's Ark didn't float until the 40th day after the start of the flood.
Okay.
And I agree with them, because of the way of the grammar of the whole chapter, actually. And so the flood is always depicted by the skeptics as happening overnight.
Yeah, all the time.
It didn't happen overnight. We're talking weeks at least. And it appears to be that the highest mountain was not topped by water until the 150th day. Now, coming back to there's not enough water on planet Earth to flood the Earth, that's just ridiculous. I mean, Earth is called the watery planet. There's you can look at, there's different perspectives of Earth, where when you're looking at Earth, you literally, all you see is water. If you're looking at the Pacific, for example, there's little islands dotting. I mean, that's the only land. That's it. And Mars, everybody agrees there was huge flooding on Mars. Where's all that water today?
Right.
And nobody has a problem with the entire planet experiencing major flooding. I mean, I forget the name of the canyon. There's a canyon on Mars, and it's huge. Certainly puts the Grand Canyon to shame. And everybody agrees, most likely, that was caused by water.
Right.
Where'd all that water go? So it's kind of ridiculous to say that there's not enough water on planet Earth to cause a global flood. Furthermore, in Genesis, it talks about the fountains of the great deep opening up. Now, there's a lot of debate over what that is, but I'm kind of leaning the direction that implies there was water underground that came forward, that came forth at the time of the flood. So, in other words, the water we have now wasn't all superficial. In other words, some of it came to the surface at the time of the flood. But regardless, even conventional geologists and deep time advocates agree that there's been continental division. So when you're moving around all these continents, that causes global flooding just in itself. Because the moment you start moving continent rapidly, because I would say it happened fast, relatively speaking, then you wind up with global flooding. But to come back to billions of dead things buried in rock layers all over the world, the top 3,000 feet of Mount Everest is covered in fossil clamshells that are buried alive in the closed position. So the highest point on planet Earth was obviously underwater. And everybody agrees with this. Yeah. Even the conventional geologists. And you can follow that layer. One of the reasons we know that is because you can follow that layer off Mount Everest down to where it's in lower elevations, and you can go and examine the fossils in the rock layer. And that rock layer continues on for huge portions of the continents. And the catch is, let's see if I can find that image here. Because the deep time advocates argue, and I agree with them on this, that the reason Mount Everest has fossil sea life on its peak is because that was all ocean floor at one point, and it all buckled up into what is currently Mount Everest. I totally agree.
Oh, okay.
I completely agree. However, those layers, here we are. So those layers, here we are, you've got the oceans, this is during the flood, or during their conventional deep time event that they don't name, just where the layers that are now on Mount Everest are the ocean floor. Well, guess what? Those layers are found parallel to each other like this. They've been laid down on top of each other. Everybody agrees that. They were originally laid down horizontally. And most of those layers can be traced to every single continent, literally. So before the mountains buckled up, this is what you had. And then during what is, hi Joe, wrong picture, during what is presumably continental division, the continents split up, all these layers slid all over the world. They buckled and folded, forming the mountains, and that's why you wind up with ocean floor sediments on mountaintops. I totally agree, but look at this. All of that, if you reverse it, by logical conclusion, all of that was under the ocean at the same time, because all of those layers can be traced to many of those layers can be traced to every continent, and almost all of those layers are parallel to each other. They've been laid one on top of each other horizontally, and that's going by what the conventional geologists say. So when you reverse it all, this is what you wind up with. You wind up with a global flood. Even people like Dr. Derek Ager, who absolutely love to hate creationists, even he said it. He talked about the world famous Austin Chalks, which is a layer in which we find the fossil dinosaur and fossil human footprints in Glenrose, Texas, and which outcrop in Austin. In fact, in Texas, they're called the Austin Chalks. That layer and the layer above and below it can be traced to literally every continent. And so if you've got that layer on every continent, then by deduction, all those continents were underwater at the same time. All the continents were underwater at the same time. What do you have? You have a global flood.
Exactly. Now, what are the secular explanations? Now, for those listening who aren't familiar with that terminology, secular meaning your starting point of explaining the layers and explaining geology is not that there was a global flood or catastrophe. It's also known as catastrophism. So a secular, they're not coming from a Bible believing perspective. What's the secular explanation for these layers that they see everywhere?
So basically deep time. And we talked about uniformitarianism, which really is what what we're getting to here.
Yeah.
That is what replaced the idea of a worldwide flood. This idea of millions or billions of years of gradual accumulation of sediments over time. And that was uniformitarianism. Now it's kind of mutated into what they call actualism now, which is just sort of they put uniformitarian in a pretty dress and called it something else. Because it's uniformitarianism, but they allow catastrophes. And it was actually Dr. Derek Ager was the one that kind of promoted that in his book, The New Catastrophism, for example, where he talked about the Austin shocks and this, what he called persistence of facies. And facies is just, it's a rock layer, basically. And so it persists right across entire continents. And so he is the one who started arguing these layers had to have been laid down by catastrophes. But there was millions of years in between these catastrophes. So that's where the deep time goes that they still need, because they're trying to get away from a global flood that happened in a little over a year. They're trying to steer away from that, and they're always continually trying to go back to millions and billions of years. And that's what they're trying to replace it with anyway. Right.
Man, there's so much to talk about on this, and we've already covered a lot of time here. We'll get to comments later, but I want to talk about one thing I watched in one of your Complete Creation Series videos. You were talking about polystrata fossils,
right,
and how that is a problem for the uniformitarian perspective. So maybe you can expand on that some more.
Yeah, and to be even more specific, the actualist scenarios as well.
Sure, yeah.
Because they so the ones I talked about the most in the Complete Creation, I could find it here. I thought I had it open. Lasai. I will open it up because there's way too many pictures to just talk about, and I'd much rather show you the pictures. So polystrate fossils are, you've got these rock layers here. Polystrate fossils are fossils which are typically buried vertically through the rock layers and cutting through multiple rock layers. They call the rock layers strata, and it's cutting through many of them, so polystrate. Poly for many, straight for the strata of rock. And there are polystrate fossils all over the world. I've personally studied them in all over Nova Scotia, some in Newfoundland, Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico. My good friend Mike Ord, who's a pretty well-known creationist, actually, he's studied some up in Alaska, for example. And I've just got to find... I've got the pictures here, but what I would like to do is call up the slideshow. If I can find it. There it is.
All right.
So Joggins on the east coast of Canada, it was recently made a UNESCO World Heritage Site. That's probably the most famous of the polystrate sites that you'll find around the world. And Charles Lyell visited it in, both my screens went black. I think I got conflict going here. Have I still got a slideshow open?
You have the, yeah, you do.
I'll try again.
Okay. Here, or I can, all right.
I've got two very black screens.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. To try it now.
So I will. I think it's on my end, not yours. So
okay.
I will resort to pretty pictures, and hope but they're lower resolution. But to give you an example, here's So this is a fossil tree. One of you'll see dozens and dozens of these at the Fossil Joggins Cliffs. This is on the Bay of Fundy. And the Bay of Fundy has the highest tides in the world. And So, excuse me. So this is during low tide. Those tides in the bay, the ocean tides, go up and down about 45 feet twice a day. So the water goes right up to the base of the cliffs here, erodes away at the cliffs, then goes back down during low tide. Another 12 hours later, comes up, brushes against the cliffs. So especially during winter months when you got the freeze-thaw cycle going on here, these cliffs are constantly eroding. And in those cliffs are countless fossils. And it's especially famous for these guys here, polystrate fossil trees. And you can see the rock layers going this way, but there's a tree buried vertically through the rock layers. And there's dozens, at any time you can go to Joggins and see dozens and dozens of examples of these. And they can be pretty spectacular. And so here's the catch. These aren't trees. They're actually giant hollow reeds. And these plants still grow today. In fact, I believe I have a picture of those. There it is. This was from the fungus guy on Wikipedia. Yeah, it looks like a miniature pine tree. Yeah, it does. But this grows right here in Ontario. Still around here today. Today they might get to maybe 16 inches tall, but in the fossil record they've been found up to 120 feet tall, which is what, 35 meters or so, 30 meters, something like that. So something very strange has happened. So these aren't trees, they're actually gigantic hollow reeds. So that makes this even more of a mystery because this isn't solid wood. What you're looking at here is the mud that filled in the hollow core of the tree and turned into rock along with all this other mud. And so if you look close, all of this, there's a compressed, coalified bark. The trunk is now coal. And it's just this thin layer of coal around the whole thing. So if these rock layers accumulate over long periods of time, I don't care, say it's 100 years to accumulate that, is that tree trunk going to stick around for even 100 years while it slowly gets buried? It's ridiculous. Yeah. And yet there are, like I said, I mean, all total, I'll bring up that picture again to give you an idea. If I can find it again. There's a picture looking one direction on the Joggins Cliffs. You can follow these cliffs. All total, you can see the rock layers here. They're actually tilted to the south. And so basically this everyone agrees, all these layers were originally laid down horizontally, and then most likely during continental division, during some tectonic event, the whole stack got tilted to the south, about 20 degrees. So you can walk along the beach, and you're now working your way up through the layers of strata. There's pushing 20,000 vertical feet of rock layers there. That from the comfort of the beach, you can walk down the beach and study them. And they are packed with fossils from bottom to top. This truly is a world-class fossil site.
Wow, that's awesome. And what province in Canada is that in?
That's in Nova Scotia.
Okay.
So right on the east coast of Canada. And it's a little hard to see. I'm standing here. This would have been like 2002, my first year at Joggins. And so that stick I'm holding, those are 10 centimeter marks, so 50 centimeters. So that whole thing is 2.5, almost 3 feet across at the stump there. But it's actually what you don't see here because it's buried under mud. This is actually a bit of a ledge here. And mud has washed down the cliff and it's actually buried it here. But that trunk continues up and it comes out here. The trunk has actually fallen out of the cliff right there. And part of one of the branches is still there. Another branch was up here. There was even apparently still leaves preserved up here. So this whole thing is cutting through about 25 vertical feet of rock layers.
Wow.
So again, is this tree going to stick around for hundreds or thousands or millions of years while it slowly gets buried? No way. So obviously 30-ish feet of rock layers were laid down in a hurry, fast enough to bury a tree and preserve it. And ironically, the actualists will agree with me on that one. They will then contend that, oh, yes, it's true, but this was actually a fossil forest. It's a horizon, because you can follow those layers and you will see other trees in the same horizon. I totally agree. However, there's a few tricky points with that. All of these trees and their roots and their branches were buried green. And were buried, all of this happened. Well, I'll show you something else here. This is one of the roots off one of those stumps. They call these sigillarias. And the roots here, you can see all these pock marks. And there's the cast impression of it. So I'm holding the cast impression in one hand and the actual root, which has been coalified now. You can see it's black coal now. The roots are also hollow, but you can see all these coalified lines coming off. Those are rootlets. So basically, from every single one of those pock marks, a rootlet radiated out from the roots. So these roots were hollow. And you can see it's actually been split from overpressure. So the weight of the mud, when it buried the roots, the weight and the pressure of the mud overlying it got in high enough that it actually crushed the hollow root, split the root, and forced the mud into the root. That had to have happened when the root was still green. And here's why. It hadn't turned to coal yet, because you can't bend coal. This was bent and then split. Coal would have shattered. It wouldn't have conformed. Coal is hard. It would shatter.
Right.
There's no evidence of shattering of the coal. So that root was green when it was compressed. The amount of pressure, and my good buddy out in Alberta, Vance Nelson, another fellow creationist, he owns the largest traveling creation museum in Canada. He also conducted experiments similar experiments on logs, because out in Alberta, you will find fossilized logs out in the Badlands where the dinosaur bones are found. Those logs were also buried green because they've been crushed flat. And you can even see that at Joggins as well. This is a fossilized tree trunk, solid wood, but it's actually been compressed flat, about 2 to 1. Wow. And so that had to have been compressed while it was still green, before parts of it had turned to coal, before the mud had turned into stone, because the mud compressed along with it. And so Vance was conducting experiments, as did I, on solid wood, trying to compress them to figure out just how much pressure we're talking about here to compress a solid wood log. And basically we weren't able to do it. We couldn't arrive at enough pressure.
Wow.
So if you can picture it now, way down here, you start to find these compressed roots. And so there had to have been at least hundreds of feet of sediments piled on those roots while they were still green, before they had turned to coal, before the mud had hardened into rock. Hundreds of feet of mud had to be piled on top of it to squish it all, right? With me so far, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Forgive me if I'm going too fast here.
No, you're good.
So we go up hundreds of feet in the rock layers. Well, up here, you will also find more roots that have been crushed while they were green, before they had turned to coal, before the mud had turned to stone. So now you have to go hundreds of feet more, because it took hundreds of feet of mud to compress those roots. Well, hundreds of feet more, you've got more compressed roots, and so on and so on, through the entire 20,000 vertical feet. So what I'm getting at is, on the east coast of Canada, 20,000 vertical feet of sediments had to have been laid down so quickly, burying all these plants, that it compressed all the plants while they were still green, before they rotted, because there's no evidence of rot in any of them, before they turned to coal, and before any of the mud turned to rock. 20,000 vertical feet. So if you had a flood today that laid down 20,000 vertical feet of mud and burying entire trees and forests, if you want to call it that, I'll give them that. I disagree with them on their interpretation there, but sure, let's say it buried an entire forest. If you had today a flood which laid down 20,000 vertical layers and buried an entire forest of trees, I wouldn't call that a long and slow geological process. I would call that a catastrophe.
Right.
And think about this for a second. 20,000 vertical feet. How high is Mount Everest? 33,000 feet, I think, if I recall. So 20,000 vertical feet, if you had that any place on planet Earth, you would flood the entire globe. So there you have it, right there. One formation on the east coast of Canada demonstrates that there has been a global flood. Boom.
That's awesome. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, and I love that breakdown, because I was excited to hear about this explanation you have here, as I heard it in your Complete Creation series, because I think you go more in depth on some of these issues than other speakers who do a great job as well. But sometimes you get a bird's eye view of issues. But I think it's really useful to break this down just to see, well, what's the scenario we need right here, and that's very helpful.
Right.
We have a few comments about. I don't think I'll get to everything because we're running a little short on time here. But let me ask one more, and I'll get to a comment here. I think you mentioned in one of your other videos about twisted roots, branches, in twisted layers. Maybe you can briefly hit on that.
Can't be done briefly.
Okay. Yeah.
It's part of the problem. It ties in with this whole idea of the trees being buried and deformed while green. And so basically that's my own research there, which I haven't published on yet. I'll just try and grab a picture real quick, which may or may not explain it. So basically, here's a stump here. You can see that okay, eh?
Yeah, I can see that.
Okay. That's the Canadian version of just so you know, the Canadian American dictionary there. So there's a stump in the cliff there. This stump actually had intact roots that were still there. And as you can see, the roots in particular are going down stratigraphically. Then they bend back up. Now, this is one of the points refuting the idea that these were forests buried in situ or in place, which is what the advocates of deep time argue. They argue that this was a forest that was buried where it grew. Well, no, that root was obviously floating. It was actually floating up above what would have been ground level. It's called negative geotropism, and that's most commonly what you see with the roots at the Joggins fossils in particular. I also did see this in Tennessee at a coal mine where I molded one polystrate fossil tree, which you can actually see a casting of that mold at the Creation Evidence Museum in Glen Rose in Texas. So if you're ever over there.
Gotta go check that out.
The catch here, though, what is harder to see as the root is going down, it's actually bending away from the camera until here, where it's running, it's neither going up nor down in the strata. It's running parallel in the strata. It is neither bending towards nor away from the camera. But the moment it goes back upwards again, cutting vertically through the rock strata, it is now bending towards the camera. And so this root and the roots down here as well, there's another stump down here that's harder to see, which incidentally, that stump is buried upside down. The roots are still there, and the impression of the stump is still there. Last I checked, trees don't grow upside down very well. So again, this fits all the hallmarks of the buried in place interpretation of the fossils, but that stump was buried upside down. Clearly, it was not buried in place. it's been tumbled, and its roots are entangled with the stump above it. But I'm getting sidetracked here. The point being, and what I show in the Complete Creation series in brief is that all of the trunks and roots and branches in particular have all been twisted.
Yeah.
They were most likely twisted at the time all those layers were tilted, because it was the movement of the layers relative to each other that caused all the twisting. And this trunk right here, you can see not only did it split the bark of the trunk in a helical spiral, the inside, the pithy core of the stump is also twisted in the same direction. And as you go up the cliffs, I don't have that picture handy, but you can follow that layer. And I agree with the deep time advocates on this one. Once you find one stump, follow that layer. You will usually find others in the same layer. Well, guess what? All the other stumps in that very same layer are twisted in the exact same way and in the exact same direction, even though they might be hundreds of feet away in the same layers. What would do that? Why would you have a tree hundreds of feet away twisted in exactly the same way as one over here in the same strata? And I would contend it's because of the actual motion of the sediments while the trees were still green, before they rotted, before they turned to coal, before the mud turned into rock. It was all, you could distort the trees. They were still green, basically.
Yeah. Oh, that's so helpful. Let's get to a question here, and we'll have to kind of wrap up our show for today. Try to keep it at least around an hour. I got a question here. Let me pull up on the screen. Can you see that?
Yes.
By Rick Greenlee. What I've always wondered is that if the first layer was laid down according to uniformitarianists, where did the second layer and so on come from? The material didn't just appear.
That is a very good question. And to be honest with you, I don't know their answer, because I don't think they have one. They would go on a case-by-case basis. They would probably look at an individual layer and say, okay, well, it's marine, which ironically, they always come back to the same thing. Oh, this is a marine layer, so it was clearly an ocean floor at one point. Yeah, I agree. But when you keep saying that over and over and over and over and over again, you kind of get towards the same overall picture. It was a global flood. Everything was an ocean floor. That's why it's an ocean floor. So, yeah. We probably have to be more specific about what layer, because, for example, the Coconino sandstone in Grand Canyon. If you ever get the chance, it's a bright white sandstone, very prominent. It's typically around 300 feet thick in Grand Canyon, and it has these dramatic. You've got the layers, the horizontal layers, but inside those horizontal layers, you've got layers going like this, and they're called crossbeds. I still remember the first time I saw crossbeds. I was blown away. I was with a guy who had actually gone to school for geology, taken a little bit of geological training. He had never seen these either. They hadn't covered that in school yet. And we were both like, how do you explain that? Why are all these layers going like this? And then a few years later, in experiments we conducted at Glenrose, we made them. We made them in what a machine called a flume, which is just basically a plastic box with clear sides. All we did was run sand and water through it. And if there was any pooled water, the sand would naturally form these sloping beds and would make this horizontal layer of sloping beds called crossbeds. So in Grand Canyon, and you can see this in all the geology textbooks, they claim those are desert sand dunes because A, it's sand. Some textbooks have even gone so far as to say the slope of those layers is too steep for it to have been formed by water. It had to have been dry sand dunes, which actually, if you stop and think about it, doesn't make sense. You can get steeper slopes on sand by wetting the sand because the sand is going to stick to itself with water. Whereas if it's dry, you're only going to get so far before the sand starts to slide off because it's not glued together anymore by the water. It's not sticky anymore. So it doesn't make sense. But they also said, and I forget what the angle was, but there was a specific quote, and I'll go over this in Complete Creation because I'll actually cite the textbook where it talked about this, and it specifically stated a specific angle, saying we know because of the angles of these cross beds in the Coconino, it's too steep for water, so it must have been desert dunes. Well, we reproduced cross beds with steeper angles than that, and steeper angles than the Coconino sandstone using water in our experiments at Glenrose. And then about, 8 years ago now? Boy, time flies. It's making me feel old all of a sudden. Probably 8 or 9 years ago now, another fellow Canadian, Ray Strom, teamed up with a bunch of my American friends there, and they conducted studies in the Coconino sandstone and found things like chert nodules and all kinds of stuff in the Coconino sandstone in Grand Canyon that the textbooks said weren't there. And
really?
So
Wow.
they presented this information at a poster session at the Geological Survey or Geological Society of America annual conference, and geologist after geologist came up and looked at the posters and just said everything the textbooks told us was wrong. There it is, right there in micrographs, and you can go and verify these. So basically, what I'm getting at is originally the deep time advocates claimed the Coconino sandstone was desert sand dunes. So they're looking at the 300 vertical feet of desert sand dunes and saying this had to have been millions of years of desert dunes. And now we've demonstrated by experiments, the guys have demonstrated by actual rock samples of the Coconino sandstone, and also by fossil footprints preserved in the Coconino sandstone, that it was all laid down by water. Nothing to do with desert dunes. So even their original explanation, coming back to Rick's question, the original explanation of where did all that dirt come from has just been nullified. So even their original explanation has been falsified. They can't even go with that anymore.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you for answering that. So I think we're going to have to wrap up today's episode. Maybe we can have you on again in the future and cover some more of these things. I try to keep it around an hour-ish. So,
yes.
But I know you're a busy man, so we'll be in touch either way. Man, this has just been so great. Just breaking down some of this evidence, and this is just the tip of the iceberg of things for the global flood. And hopefully, maybe you want to sum up again, like as it relates to 2 Peter, why this matters, the global flood, and we'll kind of close out with some closing thoughts on that.
Okay. The whole idea, even Jesus spoke of the global flood and Noah and the ark. He spoke of them as real events, literal people. It was a global event, and he compared it to the coming judgment of Christ's return. And presumably, Christ coming back to judge the earth doesn't mean he's just going to come back and judge a small area in Israel. I'm kind of under the impression he's going to judge the whole world. And he used Noah's flood as, what's the word I'm looking for? As a metaphor for the coming judgment. And he said this was a judgment that overtook the whole world. They were marrying and giving in marriage, and until the day the flood came and took them all away. And so shall it be at the end of days, when Christ returns and judgment is on planet Earth. And my only question would be, where do you stand in all that? Christ could turn and come back at any day. Where do you stand? Are you going to be ready? Will you be prepared? And yeah, I was going somewhere with that, and I forget where it was now.
No, it's great. Absolutely, totally agree.
Oh, yeah. So Charles Lyell tried to replace all of this with this fictional history, which had no foundation in science, no basis in reality. This idea of millions, perhaps billions of years, he tried to replace a global flood and the powerful, overwhelming evidence for it that we see literally all over the world. And he tried to replace it with a fictitious story that he made up in order to try and discredit this book, the story of judgment, and in effect, the story of judgment to come.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course, they're just like Noah and his family were saved through the ark. Jesus is our ark of salvation from the coming judgment ultimately. And it's a free gift for all that would trust in Jesus. And so there's great confidence that we should have in God's word, and great confidence that everything he says will come to pass, will come to pass, and all of his promises are true and trustworthy. And I just want to thank you so much, Ian, for your time today. And thank you guys for watching. I know we had a technical glitch earlier, but thanks for sticking with us. And I really hope you guys will share this episode on our Engage Apologetics Facebook page or on our Engage Truth YouTube channel. Share, like, and subscribe. And hopefully more people out there can engage with the truth and hear the truth of God's word all the way from Genesis to Revelation. Thanks for watching, guys.